did grow up in St. Louis, and I have come to understand that my experience is really the stuff of legend. Because when I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, things were really different than they are now. I grew up on the 4900 block of Terry between Kings Highway and Euclid. Do you all know where that is? I understand that it's referred to as North St. Louis now. We refer to it as our neighborhood. We didn't have those kind of labels. Here's why I say it's the stuff of legend. Because when my parents moved into this house on the 4900 block of Terry, they were the second black family to move into that neighborhood, the first having moved in the day before. And within 2 years, all the white people moved out. I always tell people, I knew I came from a powerful family. How many people can do that? Make everybody in the block move someplace else. And it was a lovely neighborhood. Beautiful homes, brick houses, hardwood floors, stained glass windows, sloping lawns, beautiful trees on both sides of the street. It was a neighborhood that was full of amenities. There were grocery stores that we could walk to in several different directions. There was a wonderful drugstore, family-owned drugstore. It had playgrounds and parks that were always well kept. Everything worked beautifully. I did not know that there was any other way to live. But it was all black. It was all black during a time of legal segregation. It was all black during the time when legal segregation was abandoned. And it was a time in which people who were black were locked out of the mainstream. But the black adults there did everything that they could to make sure that the children were protected from the sting and burn of racism and could take advantage of all the magnificent things that St. Louis had to offer without having to experience the sting and burn of racism, like being able to go to the outdoor opera. Oh, I saw them all. Being able to go to the St. Louis Museum when there was something special and having our own private docent to take us around. Being able to experience anything that St. Louis had to offer. And I can remember, without knowing what was going on at the time, when we would go to that outdoor opera, the adults would sit around the perimeter shooting stares at us, making sure that we didn't do anything to embarrass them or ourselves, and that nobody could make us feel that we didn't belong there. And it worked. I tell people that when I grew up, the black adults created literal scaffolding that allowed us to be able to climb up and reach any place we had to go while we were locked out of the mainstream. I went to Sumner High School, a place of extraordinary excellence. Extraordinary excellence. I am a lawyer, so I know about separate and equal. And I know that in places like Mississippi and Alabama and other places, that in the educational system, that was just a complete fantasy. But I will tell you, in St. Louis, if Sumner High School is any indication, physically, that high school of Sumner was separate and equal. It had an Olympic-sized swimming pool, and we all took swimming. We had band, we had classical quartets, we had theater, we had musical productions, we had art, we had all of the sports, we had anything you could possibly imagine. We had Latin, we had French, we had Spanish. Our teacher who taught us journalism was the photographer for the St. Louis American. My teacher who taught us Spanish was an international Spanish expert. She went to a Spanish-speaking country every summer and brought us things back. My English literature teacher was a man named Dr. Thompson. He had a PhD in literature from Columbia University. In other times, they would not have been at Sumner High School. They would have been scientists and journalists and senators, but they were all right there helping us to use that scaffolding to climb up and to be whatever we wanted to be. I say it is a time of legend because I know that that's not the Sumner High School that you know. I know the 4900 block because I have visited it myself. The 4900 block of Terry sounds nothing like what I have just described. And the black businesses and all that just lined the area, they're all closed up and gone. But it is important to know that that happened. It is important to know that that existed. It is important to know that the Black community at that time in the development of the history felt it could do anything. Even though racism was stark here, the Black community was moving forward. They were creating the next generation, and they were creating a pathway that they thought was just going to be a pathway that would serve those who came behind forever. And we all ought to be really scratching our heads, doing our research, taking histories of people who are still here to find out what the hell happened from then to now. It is an extraordinary thing, but that is the St. Louis that I knew. I saw it decline. My parents continued to live here until 1996, and I continued to come home and visit them. I saw that block go down, but it was nothing like what it is now, because we had the people who were there, my parents' generation, they were able to hold on. My father and Mr. Cook were alternatively the president of the Block Association for 50 years, I guess. Either my dad was it or Mr. Cook was it. But and they protected that block, because one of the things that the Black middle class was able to do was to really be a buffer for people who didn't have the kind of connections that they had who were Black. I remember the last thing that they were able to do was to stop Domino Pizza from moving in on the corner. Because I don't know if this is still true, but when Domino Pizza first started, their claim to fame was they could deliver a pizza any place in 30 minutes. That meant they had to go tearing down somebody's block. And Mr. Cook and Mr. Glover said, not the 4900 block of Terry. And they organized to be able to go to the city council and make sure that that would not happen. But as they left, that buffer left, the disinvestment continued. It ended up as it is now. Race matters. Race matters. Race matters all the time. Race matters in everything that happens. And my story is one about the Black and white paradigm, because that is the St. Louis that I knew. We're in a different time now, and while the Black and white paradigm continues to be defining, embedded, and continuous, it is also inadequate to fully understand what is happening, and that's why I'm so pleased that the center actually has the race equity, race, ethnicity, and equity, because it's different. One of the things that we have been doing at PolicyLink is really looking at the demographic change. Because there are three things that define the world that we're operating in right now if you live in the United States of America. And that's the conversation about race that you've been hearing people talk about. We are having a national conversation about race. Whether we want to have it or not, we're having it. Every place you go, people are talking about race. It is so welcome. I will tell you, I grew up in a household in which every conversation was about race, which is why I think if people want to talk about race, it is so important to have Black people in the room, because we know how to talk about race. It is not new to us. When I was under the table as a toddler, it was about race. When I was finally able to sit in a booster at the table, it was about race. And when I was finally able to join the conversation as a teenager, it was about race. We were always talking about race, but we are having a national conversation about race. The second thing that's going on is our economy is in turmoil. Inequality has become toxic. Inequality may always be with us in some form or another. It's become toxic. It's hollowing out the middle class. It's baking in poverty. It has stalled economic mobility. That is where we are now. And the last thing that is just defining where we are is the shifting demographics. And I want you to just look at this. This is the shifting demographics in the nation from 1980 to 2050. The gray line is white people. And this isn't a particular place. This is the nation. And you see where we're going to be by 2050. 47% of the population will be white, down from 80% in 1980. But you also see that while the black population has grown numerically, and it's even grown proportionally a little bit, but the Latino population, that is the story of the demographic shift that's taken place in this country. And when you look at where we're going to be in terms of the majority being people of color, that is going to be the defining nature of the nation as it goes forward. Either we're going to deal with the problems that we have had in terms of leaving people behind, and we will be a shining beacon for the world as we learn how to have a democracy and a diverse society, or we're not going to deal with it. The fate of the nation is dependent on the very people who have been systematically left behind. And so when we think about race, we may use the term that was once only talking about the black-white paradigm, to understand that now we have to expand our notions. We have to understand that, but we can't forget that the black-white paradigm has really been defining in this nation. The relationship between black and white people, the racism that represents, it predates the founding of the country. It predates the founding of the country. And in many ways, because Native Americans were slaughtered so and isolated, that interaction between people who were black and white established the protocol of oppression, because people had to interact with each other. So you can't put it aside and act like just because the demographics are changing that the black-white paradigm isn't still important, because it is defining, but it's also embedded. If you think back to 1996, I think it was, when we deformed, which is a good word, it's not the word I meant to say. The word I meant to say is when we reformed welfare. When we reformed welfare, we actually, as a nation, we reformed welfare on the image of a black woman with children being irresponsible. That was the image. It was baked in. It was embedded in a policy development. But if you are a white woman or Latina and you come to a community and you are low income and you end up having to go on welfare, you enter a system that was reformed on the image that had to do with the black-white paradigm and all those stereotypes. There are many other things you can talk about in that sense. It is embedded, but it is also continuing. It is a sad fact that the most hate crimes, the most housing discrimination continues to happen against people who are black in this nation. But it is inadequate, because the journey of people who are Latino, the journey of people who are Native American, Asian, Hmong, all of those journeys, all of those relationships have to be taken into account, so we have to expand our notion. But race matters, it matters always. But place matters too. One of the things that all of us at PolicyLink say is that where you live in America is a proxy for opportunity. You tell me your zip code and I know way more about you than I ought to. I know whether or not, if you happen to own a home, that you can pull any value out of it. If you want to start a business, respond to an emergency, whatever might come up. I know what your chances are. The chances are that your children go to a good school. I know whether or not you will live in a natural job network, which is how people get jobs. If I ask you all to raise your hand how you got your first job, you knew somebody. Somebody said, come on down with me, they're hiring. Or, you know, your uncle so-and-so works over there, see if he can help you. Or, you know, I have a colleague who's looking for a bright young person. If you don't live around people who work, you are not part of a natural job network. Your zip code determines that. It also will determine whether or not, if there are opportunities in your region, you can get to them through a public transit system. And it determines how well you will live while you'll live, whether you're more likely to be saddled with diabetes, hypertension, those kinds of issues. And it even tells me how long you'll live. In the Bay Area where I live, people in the flatlands of Oakland live on average 15 years less than people who live in the hills of Berkeley, a distance of a couple of miles. Place matters, but every one of the things that I've mentioned is because race is baked into place. You don't have any equity in your home because if you are black and living in a zip code like the one that I grew up in, if that is the case, it is because of redlining. People couldn't get loans for their homes. It's because of decisions that were made about development. The businesses that used to be there to serve communities were destroyed during the urban renewal effort. All of those things, race matters. That when you talk about how long you live and how well you live while you live, it's hard to get fresh fruits and vegetables if you live in a disinvested community because there are no grocery stores. That's because of race. It's not like there are no people. It's not like the people don't eat. You know, so why are there no grocery stores? It's because people made decisions based on stereotypes and false information. If your children don't get to go to a good school, if your school is underfunded, it's because the property taxes have moved someplace else, because the political clout to get schools has moved someplace else. It's because a region has decided that the region is more important than the city, and all of that is based on race. I will tell you another quick story about growing up in St. Louis. I told you that we moved in and all the white people moved out. Not quite true. One family stayed across the street, and they had a daughter who was my age, and One of the myths that's now been exploded, people don't think it's true anymore, that all girls like to play with dolls. All girls don't like to play with dolls. And I'm here to tell you that most girls don't like to play with dolls, because I like to play with dolls, and it was hard for me to find anybody else who did. This white girl across the street who was my age loved to play with dolls. So we had a natural bond. And while she went to the school on the corner, Benton Elementary School, it was all white, I went to Couples 6 blocks away because it was all black. So I walked 6 blocks, she walked there, but we were in kindergarten. On the weekends, we played with dolls together, sometimes at her house, sometimes at my house. We were old enough that in 1954, we understood what it meant. I guess her parents had explained it, or my parents had explained it, and I literally remember us in the front, grabbing hands, doing that little jig that little girls do, because we were going to go to the same school. Come September, Benton Elementary School, that had been all white in May, was all black. All black. And my friend across the street was bused to the suburbs. I never spoke to her again. That was the end of that. I mention it because that was the beginning of the disinvestment in the public schools. That was the beginning of that disinvestment. So if you live in a certain district, certain neighborhood, a certain zip code, you don't have access to the schools. And if the schools, the good schools and the schools you do have access to are often underfunded and neglected. I could go on and on about all the ways that race impact place. But there's another thing that we have to think about now. Before I go to it, though, I want to go back 1 second, because I don't want to miss this slide. What it shows you is the Asian community disaggregated, because it's not enough to say Black, Latino, or Asian, because it makes a difference within. You will see here that where that arrow is, that the population, poverty, 14% of Asians live in poverty, but it's 26% among 6% of Filipino. It is so important to disaggregate. We did this work with support from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, because as they have focused their attention on health equity, they realize that once you go from data to solution, you have to disaggregate data even more to get at solutions. But I wanted to go from talking about race to talking about place to talking about the economy, because that's the other part of what I mentioned. The economy, inequality has become toxic. That the problem of poverty, the problem of people being left behind, has become so embedded in our society that a couple of things are true. One, we can't just talk about who lives below the poverty level. You at least have to talk about people who live 200% of the poverty level or below. Because you don't have to be an academic to know that just living below the poverty level does not capture the people who are at risk of being totally left behind. It doesn't really tell you the stories you need to know about what it means to struggle in America. It doesn't explain the opiate crisis. You know, we really have to look at who's locked in and being left behind. You at least have to go to 200% of poverty. And we have to understand that the disappearance of the manufacturing jobs, the vast increase in service jobs, the emergence of advanced industries, all of these things can be talked about in the context of place. What we're looking at is the 150 largest regions in the country, and using a topology to actually look at the economic prospects. So we're looking at 3 things. We're looking at places that are having an increase in advanced industries. We're looking at the decline in manufacturing, and we're looking at the quality of service jobs. We know place matters, but the economy is causing us to actually think about places differently. Because you don't have to do anything but travel the country to see that St. Louis is a city, Seattle is a city, Philadelphia is a city, but very different things are happening in those places. Using that topology, we were able to group them and look at the ones that are roaring. Look at the ones that are promising, and that's the ones that we really say where you see the beginning, the emerging, and the roaring of the advanced technologies. Then looking at the ones that are kind of steady, struggling, and then look at the ones that have been passed over. It's interesting to note that the ones that really are having really just an explosion of advanced technologies, manufacturing jobs are decreasing, but more slowly. In those that are having an explosion of advanced technologies, the service jobs are also growing very fast, but the quality is high. Isn't that interesting? Advanced technologies is influencing the things that are negative factors, like declining manufacturing and everybody being in service jobs. The service jobs are better, and the manufacturing is growing. And the manufacturing was growing so much, in fact, that we separated out advanced manufacturing from other manufacturing to be able to really see what was going on there. We then realized that it was not enough to do that topology and to put them in categories. So we did visits and case studies to be able, not to all 150, I wish we could, a much smaller number, 3. Seattle, because it was in the first category, Philadelphia, because it was in the middle, and Stockton, California, because it was one of those that was at the bottom. What we found in going to Seattle was that while all those things were true about really excitement in terms of what's happening with advanced industries, not a lot of people of color employed there. Interesting that manufacturing is declining more slowly, but the real impact of advanced manufacturing, a lot of which really required more education, more training, not less. And the service industry was doing well when measured by income, by wages, but people of color were not in the service jobs that were paying well. At least Black and Latino people tended to be underrepresented. So once again, race matters. But when you think as an academic about what we needed to know, we need to go way beyond Raj Chetty. And I'm so glad that Raj Chetty has proven what we have always said to be true: where you live is a proxy for opportunity. Been saying it for 20 years. He now says it and people really listen. But we need to go way beyond that, because we have to get into these communities. We've got to disaggregate, and we have to think about it in terms of place and what's going on. Once I did a lawsuit about requiring an automobile insurance in order to keep your driver's license. Challenged it on the basis of a constitutional violation because it was a taking of property, your driver's license, without due process. There was no due process in terms of getting automobile insurance. Went all the way to the California Supreme Court. I argued the case. They were very interested in it, but lost it because poverty is not a suspect category. So the fact that they were discriminating against people based on poverty was not protected within the law. But what you have to understand that these things that are associated with place, that race is completely baked into it. You have to understand that these things that are associated with the economy, race is completely baked into it. So I've given you a way to understand what's happening. I want to leave you with a way to talk about it. This sounds like a horrible situation to be in. And if you're living it, it feels like a horrible situation to be in. But I actually think that there is a very promising story here. And I think that we all need to get this story and start telling it, so that as we're having conversations about race, once we take people deep down, when they understand how baked in it is, how structural it is, how destructive it is, that they can see a way out. And it is not just a way out for the people who have been beat down, it's a way out for everybody. Because here's the story. This shifting demographics that I showed you, what this represents is a gift to the United States of America. Because countries that this country competes with are wringing their hands because they have an old population. Their population is aging. People aren't having enough children. They don't have enough young people. The median age of the fastest growing group, Latinos in here, is 28. The median age for the gray is 42. So that tells you a lot about how young the nation is going to remain. The median age for people who are Black is 32. Still in the childbearing years, the gift of having a young population when that is needed. The other thing that you want in a global economy is you want to be connected to the globe. And this is a world nation that we are talking about. A world nation, the biggest, wealthiest nation. The wealthiest nation is a world nation. It is connected to the globe through kinship, through language, through custom, and that is a positive thing. People who are Asian, Latino, and African American are 3 times as likely to start small businesses as people who are white. Because starting small businesses, partially because people have felt locked out, they're not enjoying being in other people's businesses, but also because the explosion of entrepreneurship is the explosion of need. It is need. It is what do your children need? What does your community need? The baby boomers who are white and think that they are going to retire on the equity in their homes have a rude awakening when they understand the people who need homes are people of color. That's who's having children, that's who's building homes, that's who's moving to the future, and they will be able to help provide what people hope for if they are able to fully participate in the economy. So we have a gift at the very time that we need it. We say that equity, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential, that equity is the superior growth model for the nation. If we get it right for people of color, we get it right for the nation. That, too, requires us to disaggregate by race to understand how we get there. We found that in 2015, the GDP would have been $2.5 trillion higher if we got rid of racial disparities in employment and income. It doesn't mean that everybody's making the same thing. It means with the bell curve, there are no racial disparities. But you've got to disaggregate to fully understand what that means. Because what you will see here is that African Americans are much more plagued by unemployment than are Latinos. And Latinos are much more plagued by low wages, very low wages, not being $15 an hour, than are people who are African American. So different things are going on. It is going to take different strategies, but equity is the superior growth model. The next thing that I just want to leave you with is that achieving equity requires that you focus on the most vulnerable. Whenever you ask, how do you go about this, you have to ask who's most vulnerable, who's being left behind, and that is where you start. A lot of people think that you're going to neglect others if you start there. Well, just think about it this way. If we had understood the crack epidemic, we would not be caught flat-footed with the opiate epidemic, right? So you just have to know that starting with the most vulnerable benefits everybody. I call it the curb cut effect. Those curb cuts in the sidewalk that are there because of advocacy of people with disabilities, people in wheelchairs with disabilities. That's why they're there. And yet, how many times have you been pushing a stroller and been so happy you didn't have to pick up that contraption to go sidewalk to sidewalk? How many times have people doing work, pulling wagons, pushing carts, not have made their burden lightened because of those curb cuts? They even save lives because 9 out of 10 unencumbered adults cross the street at the corner because of the curb cuts. If you solve problems with specificity and nuance for the most vulnerable, you solve them for everybody. Once you know what you're looking for, you see the curb cut effect is every place. Seatbelts. Seatbelts are worn because of the advocacy for children. When I was growing up in St. Louis and I was driving next to my mother and she had to stop suddenly, this was all I had to depend on. I spent many a day on the floor. But seatbelts are there because of the advocacy for children. Think of all the lives that have been saved. Not smoking. It started because of the advocacy of flight attendants. Some of you will remember when they used to have a no smoking section. That didn't really do anything for anybody, but it certainly didn't do anything for the flight attendants. They joined up with Ralph Nader. That's how we had the first not smoking on airplanes, which led to not smoking in public places. Think how many lives have been saved. Bicycle lanes. They're there because of the advocacy of the most vulnerable in traffic, but it's been proven in study after study that those bicycle lanes organize traffic and they save lives, they stop accidents. The gold standard of the curb cut effect is the GI Bill. And I have to say would be because it was administered in a discriminatory fashion. So it didn't benefit blacks the way it did whites. However, it made the white middle class. At the time that the 16 million veterans were returning from World War II, a couple of creative people thought about 100,000 of them may have trouble getting integrated back into society. And they sketched out the GI Bill, thinking about 100,000 people would benefit. Turned out 8 million of the 16 million took advantage of education, and many more took advantage of the mortgage. We didn't even have, we had 48 community colleges at the time of the war. Within 3 or 4 years after, we had 358. The GI Bill made the white middle class. You solve problems for the most vulnerable, you solve them for everybody. The good news is, equity is a superior growth model. We get it right for those who are being left behind. Everybody benefits, and all of the issues that we need to talk about, race, inequality, are on the table. Thank you.